Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer with Quilters Select, and today we're going to take a look at some best practices, some hints and tips for putting together double pointed Dresden plates or Dresden rings. Before we jump into the construction of the unit, I want to share with you some notions that I find really helpful in constructing my rings so that they lay nice and flat on the fabric. Now, one of the very first things that you'll need to have on hand, and this is a need, this isn't just a must-have, is you're going to need a Dresden ruler. And there are lots of different sizes of Dresdens available. Within the Quilters Select line, we have a 30-degree and an 18-degree. When we're working with a 30-degree wedge, you'll need to cut 12 petals to create your ring. If you're working with the 18, you'll cut 20. With either one of these rulers, or with each of these rulers, you'll find that on the back side of the packaging there's a QR code that will take you to a primer exercise or a primer project for you to create. That's the same handout that will be included in the Files tab for this week's workshop, and it walks you through basic construction of the units themselves. Now, I particularly like the Quilters Select Dynamic Dresden Rulers for a couple of reasons. One is that non-slip coating on the back. And when you're cutting anything that has an angle, any shift or wiggle of your ruler is going to result in a unit, a wedge unit in this case, that is not exactly the same as the other wedges. Now, we're creating these to form a circle or to form a ring. And we really need to ensure that each of the units, each of the petals in that ring are as close to being the same size as possible in order for that ring to lay flat. There's only so much work that a hot iron and steam can do in forcing that ring into submission. So let's make sure that we're cutting accurately and that we're piecing as accurately as possible so that the fabric will lie the way that it needs to lie. So that's our dynamic Dresden ruler. There's a 30 and an 18-degree ruler in the Quilters Select family. A couple of other things that are really helpful to have on hand. I like to use a turning tool. When we turn our petals right side out, the tip of this turning tool has a little ball point at the end. So you don't have to worry that you're going to push it through the tip of your petals. It gives you a nice edge to be able to poke up in there and get your petal fabrics laying nice and flat. I like to use a Quilters Select glue stick to hold my petals in place or hold my rings in place on the background fabric before I begin the applique process. I love that, number one, it goes on with that little bit of a yellow color, but it dries clear, so I don't have to worry about any spotting through on my fabric. So that's another notion that's helpful to have on hand. Before I start cutting my fabrics, I do like to starch them, and I starch them rather heavily so that the fabric itself has a little crispness. And that crispness is going to help as you're handling those rings to keep them, again, nice and flat. Once we have created the ring, here's one of our loose rings. Once we've created the ring itself or the plate itself, it's appliqued to a background fabric. Anytime that I'm doing applique work, I do like to put a little stabilizer underneath my fabric. This just helps to keep the fabric nice and flat, and so as you're decorative stitching, or in this case a blanket stitch, around the edge of your unit, it's going to stay nice and flat. You don't need to worry about it creeping up and making little wrinkles up underneath your fabric. So Quilters Select Tear Away Stabilizer works really well for that. It tears away very, very easily, and it doesn't leave much residue behind. So that's just another nice to have as you're stitching these units together. Now we're going to talk again in this video about how to create these basic rings and how to applique them to our background. The other thing that you will need is some thread for construction. I always reach for my Quilters Select thread. I like to use a 60 weight thread through the needle and a coordinating 80 weight thread in my bobbin. And what you'll find with these threads is that they are very fine, both the 60 and the 80. Your 60 is going to be just a hair heavier than your 80 weight thread, and when used together they will give you a nice fine but strong seam. And when you look at something like this ring, you have 12 joins as you work your way around the ring. And so eliminating any of that potential take up in the fabric or the turn of the fabric by using a heavy thread or a thick thread, that's going to throw your ring off. So that's one of those other places that we want to be particularly careful about the threads that we're selecting, so that when we get that ring sewn together, it is nice and flat as we lay it down on our background fabric. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I love the strong visual impact created by Dresden plates or Dresden rings. And regardless of the number of wedges that's being used in your Dresden block, the construction is going to be exactly the same. So the key is in working with a wedge ruler or a Dresden ruler. And so I'm going to be working today or demonstrating today the 30-degree dynamic Dresden ruler. And this is a Quilters Select ruler, meaning it has that full non-slip coating on the back side. And for something like a wedge or any kind of a unit that's cut on the angle, you're really going to enjoy having that non-slip. It's going to hang right onto your fabric so that your angles, or your wedges in this case, are cut as accurately as possible. The more accurately that your wedges are cut, or the more accurate you're cutting, the easier it's going to be for you to create those wedges or those plates that lay flat once they've been stitched into a ring. Now, Susan has written this great book featuring Dresden plates called Dynamic Dresdens, and this is available from Quilters Select retailers. So something that you might want to think about picking up and adding to your quilting library. So looking again at the rulers, and we're going to focus on this 30-degree ruler. Down the center of the ruler is a straight line, and this straight line can be used for a number of things. If we are working with a fabric that has a stripe, you're going to find it very handy to have that line that you can align right over a stripe to keep your wedges and keep your fabric straight as you are cutting each unit. You'll also find that for fabrics maybe that are not so much a stripe, but they definitely have some pattern going on that you might want to think about centering. Again, you can use that line down through the center to keep all of your wedges or all of your units aligned. Again, for fussy cutting, it might be another place where we use that straight line down through the center to ensure that each of our wedges will be cut with the same portion of the fabric running right down through the center of our wedge. The other way that you can use that line is if you would like to combine your fabrics and create something like these two-tone petals. Now in this case, the two fabrics were stitched together in strips, and then the line on the ruler, that centering line, was used to keep the seam line coming right down through the center of the ruler so that each of the units coming around the wedge were stitched exactly the same way. When you cut your fabrics, when we cut our fabrics for our wedges, we're going to start by cutting strips. And we're going to cut and lay our strips according to the size that we wish for our petals to be. Now, some of this is going to be experimentation, but in general, the further towards the wide end of the plate or of the ruler that you place your fabric, the larger the diameter, the full diameter of the unit will be, or of the circle will be. When we're working with the dynamic Dresden rulers, your largest diameter of your ring will be about 20 inches. So the further we go in this direction, when we position our strip of fabric, the larger that circle will be. The further we move up from the narrow end, the larger or the bigger the area will be in the center. And And really, it's a matter of personal preference how large these are, unless you're working with a commercial pattern. So let's go ahead and jump in and start cutting some of these wedges to see just how easy it is. For this example, we're looking at a strip of fabric that's been cut to 6 inches. So that means that my wedges will be 6 inches in length. So we're talking about this measurement here. Where I position the ruler on that 6-inch strip will impact how large this area is and will impact how large the diameter of the finished ring happens to be. If you're working with a commercial pattern, follow their instructions. If you are experimenting, then this will be just a playtime for you. Now, I like kind of a small interior, and so I'm going to position the edge, the small tip of the ruler on one end of the fabric and the 6-inch line on the other side. And we'll make our first cut. I'm going to rotate that strip around and make my second cut. Then I'll rotate the ruler. My 6-inch line goes on one end of the fabric. The tip of the ruler, or the small end of the ruler, is on the other side. Now, I could have chosen to position this ruler anywhere along that 6-inch strip of fabric. I just need to be consistent as I'm working my way down. So I want a small interior diameter. Now, when I get to the edge of my fabric, or that last little bit of fabric, this is not quite big enough to cut 2 layers, but I can open it up and cut one last unit from my piece of fabric to get as many as possible out of the strip that I happen to be working with. Okay, and it's as simple as that to cut each of your wedges. And this is whether we are working with the 30-degree ruler or the 18-degree ruler. Cutting those wedges is exactly the same. Start with a strip of fabric that is the length of the petal that you desire, and then position your ruler consistently along that strip of fabric. Now, once we have our units cut, what's the next step? So here I have some units that I cut previously, and these were cut from a 9.5-inch strip of fabric because I wanted to use the full length of my ruler. So I went ahead and cut all of my wedges. And then the next thing that I like to do, because it'll make my life easier a little later on, is I fold my wedge in half, aligning the angled edges and aligning the tops and bottoms. And I give it a very light press. And I do that because further on in the construction, having that center line marked that way is going to make my life a little easier. So once I have given them just a tiny little crease, I'll then take my unit to the machine and I'll stitch 1/4 inch away on the wide side, and I stitch with the open edge of the fabric moving into the machine first. And the reason that I do that is if anything is going to shift, I'd rather have it shift and push into the fold. If you stitch with this direction heading into the machine first, if something shifts at this end, then you may end up with your fabric edges being off. So that's our first step, is we're going to sew the wide end of our fabric. Next, we're going to sew the narrow end, and same process. I like to put the open end of the fabric in first so that if anything is going to shift, it's going to shift into the fold. Then our next step is to take the piece that we have stitched and we're going to turn it essentially right sides out. And so I'll turn it and I'll push that little end in. Depending on the fabric, if it's a fabric that's a little stiffer, sometimes I may go ahead and clip across that little diagonal to eliminate some of the bulk from the inside. So then we'll just turn that, press those ends nicely or push those little points nicely, then take it to the machine and give it a good press. Now remember, in that first step, we had pressed our fabric in half. So where that crease line was, I'll make sure that my tip at the top and my tip at the bottom are right on that crease. And that just helps to keep all of my wedges even and consistent. Now tip, as you are stitching these together, you can chain piece your units. So here's an example of my units that were chain pieced together. So I started at one end, and again I go into the machine with that folded, open edge first, stitch, chain the next piece in, stitch, 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 and then I turned it over and came back to the next end and did the same thing. So I had this wonderful little chain pieced segment that I would then take to the ironing station, cut them apart, and then they're ready to be stitched. Now when it's time to stitch the units together into their circle, I find that it is easiest if I take my wedges and I lay my wedges out in the order that they will be stitched into the full circle. Because from here, what I'll do is stitch them together in pairs. So I'll stitch these two together, 1/4 of an inch away, starting at the top and working my way down. The next group, starting at the top and working my way down. And if I have them in order this way, I just find that I'm less likely to make any type of an error in positioning. Once I sew these two together and give them a press, then I'll join this group of two, this group of two, this group of two, and I'll continue joining those units in pairs until I'm ready to join the last, or stitch the last seams together to make that full circle. For me, this is just a way to keep everything nice and flat, and I get better results that way. The other thing that I prefer is that as I stitch these together, I'll press their seams open, because again, it lays very nice and flat when those seams have been stitched open. Once your rings have been pressed flat, it's time to attach them to the background fabric. And I do this using blanket stitch applique. Now, because each of these edges has been turned and is finished, you could top stitch around the plates if you are more comfortable with that. So I do put a few pins. I'll put about 4 pins around the ring, depending on the size of the ring. And I'll use a little bit of Quilters Select glue stick in the points just to help keep everything secured and keep it from shifting. Now with my blanket stitch applique, I do like to put a bit of Quilters Select tearaway in the back. I just feel like it helps to keep the stitches nice and flat and even. I don't have to worry about any distortion. Now, when I'm choosing my thread for my blanket stitch, remember that your blanket stitch is taking a straight stitch here in the ditch of the wedge, and then it's taking that little E-stitch, or that little arm, is coming into the fabric to hold our wedges in place. So I'll choose a fabric that coordinates with the wedges. So in this case, I've used a pink Quilters Select 60 weight thread. And you can see when I lay that down right along the edge of the ring that it just disappears right into the wedge fabric. And it just takes a tiny little bite that's barely visible as it works its way around the ring. Now your blanket stitch, that straight part of the stitch, is going to be in the ditch. The little arms are coming in and holding your fabric wedges in place. So I use a stitch length of about a 2. I don't need that length to be very close together. And I like a width of somewhere between a 1.5 and a 2. But that's something that you'll want to experiment with. The longer your stitch length, the fewer stitches, or the fewer little arms, are going to be coming in and biting your fabric. As you adjust the width, the wider the width, the bigger that little arm or that little bite. The more narrow the width, the smaller or the shorter those little bites will be. So experiment and find the look that is your particular preference for your project. Now that we understand the basic construction of the Dresden units, let's create a sampler piece that we can use as a reference tool. This particular piece was created using the 30-degree dynamic Dresden ruler. And I started by cutting strips that were 9.5 inches wide. So that's the full length of the ruler itself. And then from those strips, I went ahead and cut my wedges. I cut 6 of my floral print and I cut 6 of my stripe. Now the reason for the stripe was really just to get familiar with using that line down the center so that I could fussy cut my fabrics and position them the same way for each of the wedges in my circle. Now you'll notice that 2 of the wedges have been marked with those 1/2 inch increments. When I'm working with the full 9.5 inch strips and my 30-degree ruler or my 30-degree Dresden, remember that the diameter of this unit is about 20 inches. But if I want to create something that has a different diameter on the outside, I can guesstimate with my ruler, or I now have something that I can literally measure and get an idea of what size strips I should cut and where I should position them on my ruler. Same thing for the interior. If I want something that has a wider opening, then I can measure from one side to the other, and I have a better idea of where on the ruler to position that strip. So not only does it give us a great practice piece, but it also is something that we can use as a reference as we are creating our own Dresdens going forward. Now, I mentioned earlier that I stitch my units together in pairs. So I would have stitched these two, these two, these two, these two, these two, these two, and then I would have gone back and take the pairs, join the pairs to each other, and then join the pairs to each other until we have just 2 sections left to do the final construction. And that really helps to keep those rings lying nice and flat. I mentioned that we do want to press them open. And so again, you can see how nice and flat they end up. I do start the stitching at the top edge so that if something shifts, I find it's a little easier to catch it at the bottom and to realign everything. So the next step for me is going to be to take this very large ring that I've created, and then I will applique it to a background piece so that I have something that I can go back and reference and use as a size guide each time I'm ready to create a new Dresden project. And then I'll do the same thing for my 18-degree dynamic Dresden ruler. Now, measuring from using the markings on our practice piece or on our sampler piece, that's going to get you ballpark. Thickness of fabric or weight of fabric is going to impact slightly how large the diameter actually ends up. But it's a great place to start and will save you some experimentation or some test stitch outs as you are on your way to creating your own Dresden projects.
While the Dresden rings or the Dresden plates are very straightforward in their construction, there are a number of things that you can do to change the look and feel of the units themselves. So we had a look at this piece during the construction video, and really the main difference between this and the piece we started out with is the applique over the center versus that open ring. And also we have the 2 fabrics that were joined together in order to create those multicolored petals. Now down here, a wedge was used just as an applique shape to create a leaf. Here, it's been opened up and adds a little dimension. Wouldn't that be a cute little pocket on a child's garment? And then this ring in the back, while traditionally we'll use multiple fabrics to create the ring, if you have a fabric with a very pronounced motif throughout the fabric, by fussy cutting those rings, you can create kind of this kaleidoscope effect that's happening here. And don't be afraid to layer your units, as was done here with the ring in the back and then the ring over the top, to really create a dynamic and dimensional look and feel to the element itself. So I can't wait to see what you do with your dynamic Dresden blocks.